He was old. Not very old, or as old as some people, but he was old. Once it had been different. He had lived there on the edge of the great red gum forest, well out of town, with his farm stretching out and down in front of him to the river. Fences, post and rail, kept the sheep in one great paddock or another, while windmills clacked up water for the paddocks away from the river, up the hill. It had taken years, clearing trees and scrub, burning off, ploughing through tangled roots with the old horse plodding round the stumps and then sowing the seed. All year round the sun shone, burning his skin first red, then brown, then like the tough skin of the ironbark tree. And the sun burnt the grass and the wheat and the backs of the tough little sheep after they had been shorn. And the chooks scratched around in the dry dust, beaks open, wings stretched out a little to trap a piece or two of dry air, to cool their bodies for a second. He had camped in a tent. Stringy bark poles held it up, and his great enamel mug hung from a nail driven into the front pole, his front door, when it wasn't filled with steaming black tea. Slowly, slowly the bush turned into a farm. He built his first dam between two sloping hills over near the road, and it half filled that winter when it hardly rained anywhere else, and overflowed in the 3-day storm the next summer. Sitting in front of his tent, in the canvas chair, watching the shadows slip up the hill towards him, he knew he was happy. Not many people came out that way. It was still on the edge of things, but he didn't mind. Sometimes an old swaggy would camp a night or two with him, or someone down on his luck. They'd squat beside the embering fire, watching the little flicks of flame while their dampers cooked on the hot clay beneath them. Those nights seemed to have something special about them, even though they didn't ever talk very much. It was good just to sit near another person and to click the coals and watch the sparks flash up to join the stars a stone's throw above his head. The men never stayed long, a day or two at the most, and they always carried their own things. Of course, they didn't mind having a bit of your sugar, as long as you had some of their tea. He'd hear about the big towns and the gold that was being found down the track, and once a man told him tales of California and the sea to Australia. He noticed that when it was time to turn in, they'd unroll their swags down the hill from his tent, in their own space, leaving him to himself for the night. He imagined it was because they snored, although it could have been because they wanted to be on their own. Once a week he'd saddle the horse and ride her into the little town. He left his camp when the sun was just up, not bothering with breakfast, and arrived in town 2 or 3 hours later, depending on whether the river was up or not. Like the swaggies, he didn't stay long. He'd go into the cool general store and buy flour and sugar, tea and salt, sometimes a bit of bran or pollard for the chooks, and not much else. He hadn't the money for other things anyway, and he didn't really need them. Even though he only stayed there a while, he quite liked the town, especially the wide verandas on the 2 or 3 shops, and the huge red gum beside the farriers with its great knotty warts. Everybody knew him, and he knew almost everyone. But it was good to get on the road again before the sun was up too high, his horse's nose pointing to the low hills in the distance. His 21st birthday fell on a Tuesday, and he cooked damper filled with currants and a sprinkling of sugar on top. He wondered what the Queen was eating on her throne, and thought that she was probably missing out. And so the first years passed by. One day he began building a house. Nobody knew that he was doing it, or so he thought. It was up against the forest, close to his tent, but with a better view of the river and the far plains. He wasn't sure why he started to build a house. It just seemed the right thing to do. It needed to be done. Everything he wanted came from the forest, except for the windows. Straight young trees not much older than he was became the corner posts and framed the two doors. Another, stronger than the rest, lay across the top to hold the roof. Others, roughly cut but good, were the rafters. The walls were lengths of red gum sawn over many weeks, roundish on the outside and flat inside. Scraping carefully with a hoe, he made the floor as flat as a table, and packed the earth down with his heavy boots and a sprinkling of water. Some pieces of split timber and rope made the doors, and old wheat sacks became window shutters. The chimney came from the river, as well as the stones for the fire. The hardest part was the roof. He'd never cut wooden shingles before, and he made many mistakes before he had enough to keep the rain out. It was different coming back to a house. He felt older, more responsible, more there. He brought over his canvas chair and the other things, but left the tent in its spot. He liked to sit and look at it when he'd finished work, watching it puff and billow in the warm breeze, as though it was breathing. Then he'd think about building another dam in the top paddock, about making a proper loading pen, about a shearing shed and a well, and one day an orchard. And he'd listen to the summer thunder or watch the sloping winter rain. The bush was pushed back, away from his land, fenced off and beaten. He had a farm. She was from the outback, from out past Wilcannia. The dry land was in her eyes and in her smile, and a horse was her slave. And he found that he had to go into town nearly every day. One day it was to get the flour he'd forgotten, another it was for some big iron nails, another some twine. And his horse needed shearing, and it was time to get the seed for next season's wheat crop, and he had to lend a hand when they started to build the church. He was glad that no one noticed. He had few words, and those he had were usually for men, or for buying things that hardly mattered anymore. He was rough and awkward and too tall, and there was always dirt under his fingernails. But she saw with more than her eyes, and heard with more than her ears. And before the church was finished they married, standing with the town on a dirt floor before a rough wooden cross held together by twine and a gentle miracle. She loved the house. He'd thought that she wouldn't, but she did. She climbed down from the sulky and walked all around it, slowly, looking at the way he had cut the timber, at the clever window joints, and she admired the roof shingles for a long time. He pretended to attend to the horse, fiddling clumsily with his expert fingers, while he watched her walk and stop and gaze. How had he been so happy before? When she reached the front, her gaze left his house, their house, and turned over the farm, the paddocks greening in the autumn rains she'd so seldom seen, the dam, 2 native ducks, brown specks of fluff on its surface, the river, quiet under the spreading red gums, and the hazy plain across which she had bumped to this man. Her arms went around his neck as he lifted her, like a child, and carried her inside. They'd only had one wedding present, and that was one more than they'd expected. It was from the whole town as well as the farms beyond, and it was the only thing they really needed, because he'd forgotten all about it. A bed. A great bed with brass knobs and brass bedheads and a firm wire base, and a feather mattress and 2 feather pillows. His face went as red as the sunset when he saw it, while she looked at her feet, little pleased patches of pink colouring her cheeks. Everybody laughed and clapped their hands as they crowded round to admire it. The whole town had come out, and he looked at them all, knowing that none of them had a bed as good as this one. Her hand was in his. The bed seemed to fill the house, but then other things began to fit in. He made her a dresser with cupboards and drawers for the china that began to appear and the cutlery. He made a new table cut from a native pine growing down near the river, and he made a strong chest for her clothes. She found some wool and crocheted a bedspread, splashes of rainbow in the gloom, and she found almost every day wildflowers in the forest for the window sills. He realised that his house was different now. It was a home. Before she'd come out to the farm, he hadn't thought much about work. It just happened. His mind somehow knew what a farm should look like, and while the sun was up and there was light somewhere in the sky, his arms and legs and body did what his mind wanted them to do. Before she'd come out to his farm, he'd taken each day as it had come, always feeding the chooks, but then going fence building or dam digging or cutting firewood, or even lying all day beside the river, fishing for cod or perch. Before she'd come out to their farm, it hadn't seemed to matter much about tomorrow or next year, as long as things were getting better. That was before. His mind still knew what a farm should look like, but it wasn't quite so sharp. It didn't matter quite so much if a fence line wasn't as straight as a man could get it. It was all right if it curved around a tree or a granite boulder that she loved. Each night, after a meal that still made his mouth water all these years later, they'd sit in front of the fire and talk about the next day, or the next season. She knew the farm as well as he knew her face, and when they looked at each other in the firelight, it was almost as though they were looking into the future. Their minds came together as they planned the farm, little plans and big plans, though they didn't talk much about the big plans for some reason, and one or two things they didn't talk about at all. Breakfast changed too, from a slab of bread and dripping and a mug of tea to a bowl of porridge and a fried egg on bread, or a boiled egg, or sometimes a slice or two of bacon. In the middle of the morning and the middle of the afternoon, she'd walk out to where he was working, bringing a billy of tea and 2 or 3 fresh scones or rock cakes, and they'd sit together in the shade for a while. That was when she wasn't working with him. If it was a day when they were working together, she'd take something she'd made, wrapped in a cloth, and they'd drink from the water bag. And every lunchtime he came home. He had thought that people stopped growing when they turned 21, but that didn't seem to apply to him now that he was married. It wasn't that he grew any taller, it was in other places that he grew, his chest and arms and legs. With his great bushy beard, people laughingly called him Ned Kelly, though his hair wasn't red and he didn't want to fight the world. Most days he saw her walking up into the forest and he'd stop and watch her as she walked, skirts lifted away from the dust and grass seeds. He wondered what she did there, but was too shy to ask, though he did worry a little about snakes. For a long time he didn't notice anything. There was always work, and big and strong though he was, at the end of the day he was tired. Taking off his heavy boots on the veranda and cooling his feet in a basin of water outside the house left his mind in a kind of a sleep. She stood behind him, her arms over his shoulders, and they gazed over their land as the evening haze turned their world a dreamy blue. It took a long time for him to see, this man who saw everything nature did. But when he did, it hit him like the kick of a horse. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't talk to her about it, and he didn't know where to look when she was with him. She didn't say anything either, but she laughed a lot and brought more flowers into the house and made lots of special crusty bread. Out in the paddocks, he began thinking more than he'd ever thought before. Then he stopped thinking and began to build a cradle. That cradle wasn't made, it was built. Every piece of timber was special, with a special shape or a special colour, each with a different grain running like fairy paths through the forest. He didn't hurry as he worked the timber into the right shapes and smoothed it and polished it to bring out its warmth. He didn't really need to hurry, as he had many months before it would be needed. All through the autumn he worked, and the winter on days when he had an hour or two to spare. It had to be finished by spring, even he knew that. It was the same with the sheep, though he didn't say that to her. It was finished by spring, the day after the last winter rains swept away to the hills, leaving the wet wattle blossoms glistening like yellow sapphires. It was finished, but it wasn't a cradle. It was a little cathedral. Going into town each week became a little difficult for him. He'd help her up onto the sulky and cluck the alderning horse off down the hill to their gate. As he swung it open, the horse would amble through and wait for him to shut it and climb on again, and he'd have a quick look at her. Her back had always been straight, but now it seemed to be even straighter, as though she was trying to make herself stronger. He thought she may have been trying to make more room inside, and he wondered at her, sitting beside him with her hands clasped gently over her lap. Sometimes she caught him looking at her, and she smiled at him, and he was glad that he had a beard, so that she wouldn't see the redness creeping over his cheeks. He forgot that her eyes weren't his eyes. They only went to town on fine days. She said she didn't mind driving in the wet, but he always seemed to have to do something else on rainy days. The sheep should be looked at, or he'd pull out some weeds in the new orchard because it was easier when the ground was damp, or he'd sit in front of the fire, drying off after doing something else, while she filled the room with the smell of fresh scones. The horse seemed to know too, picking her way around the potholes, walking slowly through the long wet patches, and even stopping to munch the green grass where purple flowers tumbled down a bank. As they left the bush and clopped into town, the difficult time began. People came out of their weatherboards and waved from verandas, or came down to their gates and called out to them. Her, really, as he tried to look ahead and stop the horse from bolting. The horse had never bolted in its life, but you never knew with small boys running along behind. He'd tie up at the rail outside the store and lift her down in his strong arms, spinning his mind around them both so that they were the only people in the world, her and him, and a little bit of tomorrow. Then she'd go inside. He'd put the nosebag on the horse and wonder again how she could snuffle away without any oats going up her nose or making her sneeze. Men talked to him about their stock, about the railway that might be built, about the trains and what a good season was coming up. They didn't talk about what he was thinking most about, and he was glad. That wouldn't have been right, not for the men anyway. Usually he had to get a few things in the town for the farm, and the time went pleasantly enough. But he always looked for her being ready to go home. Everyone, he was sure, wanted them to have a boy. What he wanted, he kept to himself, deep inside, so that if it didn't happen that way, nobody'd know, not even him. The time came, as it does, and he was down in the far paddock. She had been restless for days. That morning she'd lain in bed, tossing, her face more at the wall than towards him. She didn't smile for him. Breakfast was a thick crust. Afraid, he forgot to close the door as he left, tying up his boots, not saying goodbye. He went to the far paddock because he had to walk. What had he done? When would it be over? Sheep stumbled and jostled away from him. He didn't see them. Magpies sang their happiest of spring songs. He didn't hear them. Gentle September breezes played over his face. He didn't feel them. All around was new life, but he was between life and life, waiting for a few more days or perhaps a week. A cry dreamt through the soft air, a far cry from somewhere far off, from up the hill, from their house, from her. He must get to the horse. He must fetch someone. It wasn't time yet. More time, more time, more time, more time. He had to have more time. But it was time. She cried again for him. And he was beside her, in front of her, his big and awkward hands gentling the new life as it pushed out into his hands. And she slept. For a week his boots stayed clean, soles and heels, never touching the ground. People came and went, smiled, patted his back, brought over things. A shawl, a hand-knitted quilt, little things. He hadn't known it before, not really, but he knew it now. He knew that he loved her and their daughter, his baby daughter. How could it be? How could a man's heart fill and go on filling without crushing lungs and limbs and life itself? There was one thing though. He was very glad that no one saw him or heard him striding about his paddock saying, "Dad, Dad, Dad." Long before he should have, he took the little one out with him, cradled in his arms as though he were a great forest redgum and she a frail nest of twigs. He propped her up against stumps while he worked, or against rocks or logs, and picked her up when she, craning to see what he was doing, forgot how not to fall over. She chuckled and laughed and tried hard to reach her arms all the way around his neck, her nose thrusting through his beard and pressing against his teeth. Everything took longer to do. Before he fixed the gate, he had to show her the problem and explain why they needed so many gates on the farm, and then discuss with her how it should be mended, listening very closely to her opinions. Quite often he hung her from a tree in a harness he had made out of an old bag and some strong twine. She'd swing there for hours, revolving slowly as the wind blew, loving to be taller than him, crowing and learning the language of the bush. Several times a day her mother had come down to where they were and take her and hold her and feed her while he went off a little way till they had finished. Until then he hadn't realised that two people could be equally pleased and peaceful, the one empty, the other full. Then came the four boys, sweeping through the farm like a tide. Though he'd never seen the ocean, that was what it was like. At times the tide was like locusts, and he wondered how he'd keep the food up to them. At others it was like a hurricane, bending the wheat to the ground, and he wondered how he'd save enough for market. Each one he took out to the paddocks, long before he should have. Some hung in the harness while the hot winds blew the red dust around. One hung there with a sort of umbrella over him, catching the rain in his pudgy hands, already strong, and with dirt under his fingernails. Each had his go in the harness, till he found the three of them spinning the fourth around and round, the twine tightening round his yelling red giddy head. But he didn't stop the unspinning, and laughed as his youngest son unwound and then tried to walk when they lifted him out. It was good. It was what life was about, though he didn't think of it like that then. But there was more to do, much more, and the days didn't lengthen enough to fit it all in. The house shrank, or so it seemed, long before the last boy arrived. Even putting some of the things in the old tent only helped for a while. So they tramped the farm for a new site, large enough for the new house and a vegetable garden and a bigger chook run. He didn't like the idea of leaving the hill, but there was no room and the soil wasn't really very good up there. They chose a spot right down near the river. There was some flat ground a little way up a gentle slope that was just right, she said. The river flat was just right for the vegetable garden, and if they had a flood it wouldn't matter too much. The chook run would go nicely between the house and the vegetables, up the hill a bit. She spoke as though she could see it all, as though it was already built, with smoke drifting up into the soft evening air, a wide veranda all around. And that's the way it was, nearly 2 years later. He'd always known that the years came and went like the seasons, that sun followed rain, that life was always there or on the way, growing or sleeping before growth, that something which was the soil, the air, the forest, the land gave meaning. But over all these had come to him something that was more. He didn't know what it was, hadn't known what it was, until it had gone. They stood on the new platform watching the last smudge of smoke phase into the heat, shimmering over the line that led to some far-off war in some far-off desert land, leaving them long before a daughter should have, leaving them for... And the boys had gone too, to new farms, to a new paddle-wheeler on the great brown river, one even to work on a newspaper in the city. And then, suddenly and easily as sleep, as the sun stretched its light fingers through the morning windows, he was alone. The magpies sang on the roof. The crows blacked across the limitless clear sky. The land warmed. Insects began their dreamy summer hum. But his soul had fled. Somehow, too, the colours of life seemed to fade. Standing on the flat ground by the river, the great forest trees at the top of the hill seemed to be greyer, their bark not quite so brown or green or red, their leaves not so lively in the evening breeze. What does a man do when he falls alone? He'd been alone before, but he hadn't known. He'd been building a farm. Then he'd been building a future, and he certainly wasn't alone. Was it really over 30 years? Nearer 40, though it seemed timeless. And it had been so full of building and planting and harvesting and driving into town and growing and laughing and... What does a man do when he's alone? He gets on with it. Farms have to be farmed, fences have to be mended, fruit trees have to be pruned, but not in the middle of summer. Make sure the dams are holding the water, patch where needed. Fix the sails on the top windmill and grease the pistons on all of them. Shoe the horse. Get some new wire netting and nails to keep the foxes out of the chook run for a few more years. Build a new loading pen and ramp for the sheep. He'd been meaning to do that for a while. Much easier to drive them up a ramp than manhandle them into the wagon. And he has to learn to cook again, to keep body and soul together, as he said to anyone who came out to see him. There was a bit of darning to do too, but not all that much. Holes in his socks had never bothered him in the old days. Why should they now? He was a man of the land. Sometimes, not nearly often enough, there'd be a letter from one of the boys, and he'd fidget and fudge while the postman had a cup of tea and a yarn, itching for his friend to go so he could get to the crumpled lines. Lines that led out to the mighty Murray River, to presses and ink, to a farm where it seemed to rain every day of the year. They told him about running into snags when the river was low and having to pump for their lives. He took that with a grain of salt. They could have walked away from the boat if the river was that low. They told him about machines that could rumble out hundreds of newspapers an hour, of dairies with 40 or 50 fat cows to milk morning and night, of children being born and sent off to school. He wondered if any of them swung from a tree in an old bag. Thus does a man when he's alone, but he had to admit that it wasn't as easy as it used to be. 4 boys can be a bit of a help, and you get used to them being there. You stock the farm for 5 workers, you buy those extra cattle or sheep, or keep a few more than you would have if you'd been on your own. You plant more wheat. He had started to wind back a little as the boys drifted off, but he'd felt good and he didn't want to see the farm go right back to the old days, before she had come. After a while, he noticed that a few more people seemed to be coming out and dropping in for a couple of minutes to see how he was doing. Usually they'd have one of their boys with them, who'd slope off and look around while cups of tea were made and drunk in the kitchen. Later he'd find that there'd been some wood cut or a fence mended or the chook pen cleaned out. It made him a little cross, but he couldn't stop them. Did they think he was getting too old to do those things for himself? They mightn't have, but his son certainly did. One day they'd all turned up at the farm, without a word of warning, without their families. He'd been delighted, though a little suspicious. Treats like that only happened at Christmas, and then only 1 or 2 of the families came at a time. The wives bringing real life back to the kitchen, and the kids scattering the chooks around the yard like exploding feather pillows. The boys were cheerful, though they looked a bit serious, and they'd spent quite a lot of time poking around the place, looking at their old bedrooms and the firewood box, checking the sheds. They'd brought out some cold meats from the town and some bottles covered in ice, and in the heat of the day they'd all sat around on the veranda, talking quietly, cutting off hunks of bread and looking over the river and valley to the hills. He kept on looking at them, these men of his, waiting for what had brought them. It was a long time in coming, but it came, and it came with the truth that he knew, and he was glad that it came from them, and it began with the best word of all. "Dad, we think it's time you turned it in. The farm's getting too much for you. You're not as young as you used to be, you know. We don't like you being so far away from everybody." Each of them had said something. He couldn't remember what they had said now, but he could still hear what it sounded like, and how they had looked when they said it. Some of the colours came back as he listened, though what they were saying meant so much, they couldn't know how much. They were asking him to leave the farm. He did, but not to the thriving dairy farm the two youngest owned, down in the softer misty hills of the south, nor down to the great Murray River which lifted the paddle steamers 40 feet to the high wharf at Echuca when the river was up, and certainly not to the city, even though they printed a newspaper every day of the week, morning and night, except Sundays. He shifted into town. Some old friends had done the same thing a few years before, and they offered him a cheery room at the back of the house they'd settled in. Living in town was different. He could talk to people almost whenever he wanted to, people he'd known for years but had never really had a good long chat with. Something always seemed to be happening. The train came in twice a week and left twice a week the next morning. At least once a month someone got married in the little church he'd helped build. And for various reasons that he'd never quite understood, there'd be 2 or 3 nights each year when everybody let off firecrackers and rockets. They were very good to him, his old friends. She cooked him lovely meals and did his washing and things, and they'd spend most evenings in the front room, playing cards or listening to the radio, or just talking in front of the fire. He was never short of company, and he never really had anything to do. Then the letter came. "Dear Dad, the newspaper's gone bust. Can I come home and take over the farm?" He suddenly discovered that living in the town wasn't so bad after all. The house was next to the post office, and the post office was open, and he was in there writing the telegram before the postie had blown his whistle next door. "Yes, Dad!" Though they wouldn't let him put in the exclamation mark. And they charged him for 12 words. And he hardly sat still for the next 10 days, waiting for the train to steam his oldest son home. Together they squeezed into the seat of his old friend's ute, their bags thrown in the back, and they laughed as they drove out the rutted track to the farm. But he didn't move into the house down by the river. He knew that one day a girl with the dry land in her eyes would smile at his son, and that they should have the house for themselves. He climbed the hill to his first house, and the few shreds of tent which hung like faded but not altogether defeated pennants from the broken ridgepole. It took him quite a long time to get up there, and he was puffing a bit when he arrived, but he didn't mind. Only a few days were needed to get things cleaned up, and his son gave him a hand in between working on the river house. Once again he sat out the front, looking over his farm, his son's farm, to the far hills. Slowly, contentment began to creep back. Up here he was next to the forest, and he began doing what he used to see her doing most days. Although it was faint almost to illusion, he knew the path she used to take, around the back past the water tank and the remains of their first chook house, and over the fence on the stile he had built the first week she had come. He had always gone into the forest further down, at the gate, because that was what gates were for, and he always had some wood to lug back. He hadn't realised that it was far better to go into the forest by her way, and he started to joke to himself about going in style. Now that he didn't have to look for timber to cut, he had time to look at the forest, and he began to see why she had gone into it so often. It was a world where the trees shaped each other, opening up to let the sun fall on glades of wallaby grass, or nodding pygmy orchids, or bronze-scale lizards sleeping alertly on warm rocks. As it had with her, the forest took him in as he walked slowly along its paths. It shaded him and warmed him, breathed into him and lulled him, and called him. Slowly he forgot the farm. Less and less did he look out over the river to the hills. Now he looked away from his land, into his forest, which she had found before him. His forest, which had given him his house and his children's cradle, and their dresser and cupboards and table and chest. And he realised that it had been his forest all along, even back when he had built his first fence and frightened the wild animals with his axe blows and hearty singing. He stood and looked at his forest, this tree of an old man amongst older giants, his back to the rough bark. And the bark roughed his skin caressingly as he slipped slowly down against the trunk to the ground. And there he went, a man finally alone, with his trees and his birds, his wind, his rain, his her, and his son striding up the hill towards the old house, fresh eggs in a billy and news in his eyes.